Alright, hey everyone, Eric aka Justice Blinded back here with another Cube Draft video to talk about Cube drafting strategy. Now there are very many levels of drafting strategy. I'm going to try to go through some beginning tips, some intermediate tips, and some advanced tips throughout this video talking about Cube Draft. If you don't know what a KeyForge Cube Draft is, go back and look at my first video which I made, which explains the basics of the draft. In this video, I will assume you've either seen that video or are otherwise independently aware of how a KeyForge Cube Draft goes. So some of the very basic elements of that, I will not be re-explaining this video. For that, you can look at the original video. One other thing before I get started I want to explain is some terminology that is commonly used by people who draft, I guess in other games, but now in this game. And that is the notion of a house being open or closed, right? If you say a house is open, what that means is based on the information you've gleaned from how the draft has gone so far, you are determining that particular KeyForge house that you're targeting is available, right? That not a lot of people around the table that you're playing in that pod of drafting, not a lot of people are playing that house, versus a closed house, meaning you believe that there are one or more people already playing that house because you haven't seen a lot of cards that are available in that house, or the cards are not as good, or whatever, right? So that's what open versus closed means. I'll be using those terms in this video, just kind of an opening information and description. So we're going to talk now about decisions, and we're going to use a pack as an illustration, right? So here's an example pack that you might get past. Imagine you're playing a cube draft, and you are given this pack. This is the pack that you open, and these are all the cards that you would choose from. Now, I put the word signals at the top left of the screen here because that's the next thing I want to talk about. What is a signal, right? A signal generally it's usually related to a card or cards that you see during a draft that indicates that a certain house is open or sometimes closed, right? So if you see a lot of really good Mars cards being passed to you, that might be an indication that Mars is open, right? That might be a signal that Mars is open in the draft, meaning that other people in the draft are not playing Mars, or there are only a couple people playing Mars, or maybe no one playing Mars, right? So that's an example of a signal. So let's apply that to this pack. So you open this pack, right? And let's say you're playing in a larger draft, an 8-person draft. So you're only going to get 2 cards from this pack. Let's say there are 8 people at the table, and there are exactly 16 cards in this pack, so everyone will get 2 cards out of this pack, but you're only going to get 2 cards. That is one of the most important things that you need to know off the top, because it will affect your decisions. How many cards out of this pack am I getting? So look at this pack for a minute and try to think, pause the video if you need to, think to yourself, this is the first pick of the draft, what card would I pick? So feel free to pause the video and come back. And I'll tell you what my line of analysis would be, right? So the very first card, the very first pick of the draft, you don't know anything about what anyone else is playing. I'll talk a little about later. You might know about player tendencies, but you have no information to you other than the cards that are in front of you. So you have to make a decision to what card to take in this pack. But you know you're only going to get, let's say, 2 cards out of this pack. So the cards that jump out to you are probably things like Martian Generosity is a crazy card. I'm a Mars. I love old Coda Mars combo stuff, so I like Battlefleet a lot. That's not as good as Generosity for reasons we'll talk about in a moment. Key Abduction is a combo piece, right, with these things. You might really like Encounter Suit if you're a Star Alliance player. Fagin is decent if you're a Shadows player. You might like Logos Disruption. You might like Disruption in general, so you might take Scrambler Storm. Other than that, I mean, unless you're just a diehard Untamed person, I don't think I would take anything there. Again, this is all first pick. Not to say these aren't good cards independently. If you really want to force Saurian, you can take Curiosaurus, although that's a build-around card, so it's fine to take it early, although with the other options in this pack, I'm not sure I'd ever consider taking that card. Barrister Joya is a disruption card that's pretty decent, but I'm not really a Sanctum player in drafts that much. That's kind of my tendency, not that I'm opposed to it. but also there are better cards in this pack. So I think most people would likely agree the best card in this pack is Martian Generosity. So before we just immediately snap pick Martian Generosity, let's talk about other things in the draft, right? Other things that you might see in the draft. And that's where we have to introduce the concept of cutting, right? What is cutting? So cutting in the context of draft means you are taking a card or cards out of a pack to reduce the number of cards, reduce or eliminate the number of cards in that house from the pack. Because remember, you are passing each round, you are passing all of the packs. As soon as you're done picking a card, you're passing them to the person on your left or your right. So they will constantly be seeing information from you if they're paying attention. And if they see, for example, that there are never any good discards being passed to them, then they're very unlikely to start trying to force dis. If they're paying attention, they're very unlikely to not start trying to force dis in later packs, because they know that the likelihood that someone to their right, whether it's you or the person further down the line, is already taking dis. So dis is not open, right? Like we said earlier, open versus closed. If dis looks closed, then that sends a powerful message to the person to your left. Why do you care what the person to your left thinks? Well, because the next round of drafting, round 2, they're the ones that are going to be passing you cards, right? So you want them to have made a decision to play in houses that are not your houses, right? You want, the ideal draft is for you is a symbiotic relationship. Obviously, you can't well, not obviously, but it's worth saying you can't communicate verbally or otherwise with the person next to you, right? You can't turn to the person next to you and say, like, oh, I'm running these houses, don't draft these houses. They're okay, I'm running those other houses, don't draft these houses, right? That's like collusion that will be considered not appropriate in pretty much most drafts. If you want to do that, it's kind of a wild environment. But most drafts will not allow you to do that. So you have to try to influence their actions through other ways, and one way is by cutting. Now, what does that mean in the context of the pack you see, right? So there are several at least above average Mars cards. Grabber Jammer is close to average, but I'd argue it's an above average card. The rest of these are clearly above average Mars cards, right? So one of the factors you may consider is, if I take a Mars card and we're still passing these 3 Mars cards, the person to my left doesn't know that Generosity was in this deck, right? So if they get past all of these cards, one of the things they may think is, wow, Mars seems very open, right? Mars seems like it is something where I can easily play. Like, I can't imagine what card, and there's really probably only one, I can't imagine what Mars card someone would take out of this pack that wasn't one of these 3 cards. And so that person must not have taken a Mars card, so Mars must be open. But as we know, that's not the case in this situation, but that is a factor you have to consider when you're determining what cards to pass, right? So you could actually make an argument in this pack, if you are trying to draft in a strategic fashion, for taking something like Fagin. Now, Fagin, in my opinion, is definitely not the best card in this pack. It might be the 5th or 6th best card in this pack. But Shadows is a good, I mean, all the houses in a cube are likely to be decent, but Shadows is a good house to be in. And if you take Fagin, you are cutting Shadows out of this pack, right? You're passing a pack to someone, and they see no Shadows cards at all, right? So if you're able to do that a couple packs in a row, whether it's Shadows or some other house, then that person is very unlikely, especially early on, to make a decision that they want to try to play in Shadows, because they either have no options or very poor options compared to the options of other houses. And what that means is you're kind of, coercion is a strong word, but you're basically coercing the opponent to your left or your right, whichever way you're passing, to say, like, hey, don't play this house because I'm not going to give you any good options, right? Now, obviously, that's all assuming that your opponent is paying attention, but even if they're not super advanced in draft, if they get no Shadows cards passed to them, they're going to figure out pretty quickly that they don't have an option to go to Shadows because they just don't have any cards. So by the time packs 2 and 3 and even 4 roll around, they will have already made a decision to commit themselves to other houses, and therefore you're more likely to be getting good Shadows cards passed to you early on and later on in a pack, because they've made a decision not to play those cards. Now, there's one wrinkle into this discussion, particularly for the KeyForge draft, and that is the issue of Mavericks. If you watch my introductory video, you'll see that I explain that in the video, in the cube that I play, the format I play, you're allowed to Maverick 2 cards at the end of a draft into opposite houses, right? So you're allowed to Maverick, say you have these 2 cards, right, and you wanted to Maverick these 2 cards, you can Maverick this into Mars and Grabber Jammer into Logos, right? Because you have to switch the houses exactly. So the wrinkle that puts in is if you have an overwhelmingly overpowered card that is good in all houses, so like Martian Generosity is probably really good. I'm trying to think of a house which it would be bad in. I can't really come up with one. But it is probably really good in almost any house. So even though it's called Martian Generosity, ironically enough. Battlefleet, on the other hand, is an example of a card that's not good in every house, right? Because Battlefleet requires you to reveal all the Mars cards in your hand, and if you're not playing Mars, then the card is useless, right? You could, in theory, Maverick it into like Logos and then also play Mars, but that's not something you're likely to do. So cards that would be good to Maverick with stuff like Martian Generosity or Key Abduction in the right deck. So that puts a little bit of a wrinkle into it, because even if you pass, if you took Fagin and passed it to the person to your left, they would probably take, I would imagine, if it were me, I would take Generosity pretty much at any point in time, unless I absolutely had to have a different card later in the draft for some specific purpose to shore up a hole in my deck or something. Because Generosity is probably going to be your Maverick if you're not playing Mars, so Generosity is a safe pick overall in this pool. Even though you're sending mixed signals by passing all these good Mars cards, you can always Maverick this card. It's good enough that it can be your Maverick for just about anything. So, but if you take Generosity out of this pack, right, if this were your starting pack for some reason, then I think it becomes very different, because Key Abduction is a card that you could Maverick into other houses, but I don't know that Key Abduction is good enough to take that first pick, because if you don't have a mechanism, and remember, when you get this pack, when it goes through 7 people and comes back, you may not, like Battlefleet may not be there, right? And if someone else has taken Battlefleet, then that's one of the possible combo pieces with Key Abduction. You need a way to get all the stuff in your hand. It's still an okay pick, first pick. But I don't know that if you take Generosity out of this pool, I would be willing to do that. I'd be even more inclined to take Fagin at that point, for the reasons I've just expressed, or maybe Scrambler Storm. I'm not super concerned about Wormhole Technician being passed to someone as a signal. I don't really care about that, right? That's a good card, but that's not like, oh my god, Logos is open because Wormhole Technician is in the pack. Like, that's not a thought process most people are going to have. So that is an example of what you might think, of how you might think to draft logically. So there are a lot of different concepts that we talked about just in this one pack. Like, this is the very first decision you make, but you could see all the possible things that go into that, from the very basics of signaling, like, oh, someone passed me all these Mars cards, Mars must be open, to, well, maybe second level thinking is, what are my opponents going to be thinking, right? So that's why you might take Fagin, because you're trying to create a specific image in your opponent's head, and then, you have to remember if you're doing Mavericks, because you might take Generosity, just because it's good enough to play as a Maverick regardless. So now that we've talked about that, we're going to go on to our next concept. Our next concept is called hate drafting. What is hate drafting? Well, so hate drafting is a term that is used. It's used to refer to drafting a card that you have no intention of playing, but that you do not want other people to have, right? So keep in mind that when you're drafting in a cube, you're going to be playing games against other people who have made decks out of the same cube. So every card you don't take in a cube draft that you pass to someone else could eventually get played against you. And there's a decent likelihood, especially if the card is good, that it will be played against you. So one of the considerations that you have is, how badly do I want to remove a card from circulation, if you will? Remove a card from the pool of cards that other people are using. How badly do I want to do that versus take a card that I can use? So I'm going to give you an example. Here is an example pack. Let's say you are in pack 3, late in a pack 3 or 4, late in a draft, right? So you are already set. You know you're going to be playing, let's say, we're going to talk different hypotheticals with this pack. let's say you are playing a Logos Sanctum Saurian deck, right? So you're playing a deck that has Archiving and Logos, has a bunch of Exalting and Capture in Saurian, and has more Capture in Sanctum. So that is the deck you're playing. We are late in a draft. This is the 4th round of a draft, let's say the last round. And immediately you open this pack, or you're past this pack, and there are no cards here for you to take, right? You could take a card in Maverick if you haven't, or you usually have identified a Maverick by now, but let's say you haven't. You could take a card in Maverick, one of these cards. But assuming that you already have a Maverick and that's not a major consideration, or even if you have, honestly, there are some overwhelming considerations in this pack. Think about what you would want, right? What cards in this pack terrify you if you are running a deck that is heavy on Amber, Exalting, and Capture, right? There are several cards that terrify you, right? Hysteria for sure terrifies you, right? Because you don't want someone to be playing Hysteria against your board that has all this Capture or Exalted Amber. A Word of Returning is also a card that scares you a lot because you don't want like your entire deck to implode when they play one card, right? And odds are someone somewhere in your pool is playing Untamed or Dis or both, and you don't know which one. And so while in a lot of cases these cards are not as good as, say, like in Furnace, in just an objective standpoint, these cards are horrifying to you if you are playing a Saurian Sanctum deck. So, there are other cards that also might horrify you. Like, you might have a bunch of big creatures, like, you might not like that. You might not like Red Alert. You might not want to hand combo pieces to a Star Alliance player, but if you're playing the specific deck I mentioned, these are, without question, the two that horrify you. So which one do you take? Which one do you take to remove it from circulation? Well, that depends on a few things. That could depend on any signals you've received in the draft, like you have a strong feeling someone is playing one of these two houses. Again, I think it's unlikely that you would be in a draft, even with 4 people, and like no one's playing either Untamed or Dis. That seems super unlikely. So the more predominant consideration I would suggest is what kind of Saurian or Sanctum deck you have. Do you have a lot of wards, right? Some cards in Saurian ward creatures a lot. So you might not care as much about Hysteria. You still don't want it, but you might not care enough about Hysteria or as much about Hysteria as you do Word of Returning if you're able to ward your creatures consistently. If you don't have a lot of wards, right, then Hysteria is probably more terrifying than Word of Returning most of the time. Again, it really depends on the type of mechanic you're running in the Saurian deck. Are you running a Senator Brackus deck where you're going to be intentionally putting a lot of Amber in your creatures to try to key cheat in something? If you have that sort of deck, do you have Imperial Forge, right? Can you key cheat on the same turn you can put all the Amber in your creatures, in which case, neither of these is particularly horrifying if you can set it up. But if you don't have those things, then you have to go back to, well, if I don't have any wards, I probably got to get rid of this. And if I do have a lot of wards, I probably got to get rid of this. But now let's change the hypothetical. Say you're not playing a Logos Sanctum Saurian deck. Say you're playing a deck with three different houses. It's difficult to conceive a deck with 3 different houses where none of these cards would help you, but let's imagine you had a deck like that. You had a deck with different houses that wouldn't necessarily help you. And then you would get past this pack, and it's hard to imagine you wouldn't want anything out of this pack, but let's say your deck is full. This is the very end of the draft. Your deck is full. You're not going to be adding any of these cards to your deck. Now what card do you strike? Well, there are several different factors, right? It depends on what you've seen in the draft, right? Have you seen a whole bunch of upgrades, right? Have you seen a whole bunch of upgrades in Star Alliance that you have to worry about this? Have you seen a transporter platform or 2 if you have 2 in the cube? Have you seen these things pass through the cube and know that the pieces are out there where Nell could be exploited? I would point out that depending upon how many people are in the draft, when you're down to 7 cards, each player may have had a shot at this pack already. And if each player has already had a chance to take cards out of this pack, that tells you a lot. Because that tells you that if there is a Star Alliance combo player playing out there with platform, there was something other than Nell that they took out of this pack, which is very unlikely. It's possible if there was like specifically platform in the deck, then maybe they would take Nell, but that seems fairly unlikely. So if Nell is already passed around the table once, you could probably be confident, not 100%, but you could be more confident, let's say, that Nell is unlikely to get abused by your potential opponents in the draft. But if it hasn't, if you're playing a larger cube, and this is for some reason the first time, you've seen, if half the table hasn't seen this pack before, then Nell is a much bigger problem. Same thing with Drummernaut, right? Because assuming you have Gengar Chieftains in the deck, that's one half of a pretty nasty combo in Brobnar. If the deck hasn't passed around to someone, then if there are people in the cube who haven't seen this pack yet, then they will easily snap up Drummernaut if they're playing Brobnar. So that's another consideration. Just those sort of things happen. Have you seen a whole bunch of really pesky artifacts in the draft? Do you have a bunch of really pesky artifacts? Right? You might want to hate draft this card. Right? That might be the most important thing. There's a corner case where if you're playing Saurian and you have, like, if your cube happens to contain, usually there aren't a whole lot of duplicate cards in a cube, but if your cube happens to contain a couple copies of Spiral or something like that, and that's basically your win con, you're running like a Spiral Rex deck, then maybe, even though these things are horrifying, maybe this is the thing you take because that just blows up your win con, right? So maybe that's what you hate draft. You can see all the possible options, right? You can take hours and hours discussing all sorts of I just spent, 15 minutes, 10 minutes talking about just this pack and just the considerations that you would have in one draft with this pack, depending upon what you're playing. And so you can see the layers of strategy are very, very deep throughout the cube process. And you have to be constantly aware in order to be great at cube. You can have fun playing cube regardless of, you don't have to be top tier skill level in order to play cube. You can have fun playing cube any way you want. But if you want to be an elite cube player, these are the sort of considerations you need to take into account. There are a few more considerations I recommend that you think about when you're playing cube. First, know your opponents. First of all, are your opponents good at playing KeyForge? Right? Are they good at evaluating card quality? There are outlier examples where it's pretty clear to anyone who has any concept of how to play KeyForge that the card is good, right? Generosity is always going to be good. I think most people would think that certain other cards are good, like Spiral, probably most people would think are good. I think most people would understand that Jar, Eaton's Jar, is an amazing card. But there are other cards that are very good, but if you're playing with a group of people and you have a marginal decision and those people are not very good at analyzing card quality, then you can take that into consideration. You could run more risks and try to get a card passed back to you that is very good. The other thing you might want to know about your opponents, do they always want to play certain houses? Like, do your opponents always want to play Dis? Do they always want to play Logos? Do they always want to play Brobnar? And you could take that into consideration. If someone is going to force a house, and force is another term we use when we're talking about a draft, if someone wants to force a house, meaning that they go into the draft saying, I don't care what cards I'm passed, as long as I'm passed enough cards to play the house, I'm going to play Logos, right? If you know that person is going to do that, you can exploit that by decisions you make throughout the draft in terms of, what cards they're likely to take. Does everyone in your draft cube hate Brobnar, right? Because remember, in a cube, it's not like Worlds Collide Brobnar or AOA Brobnar, it's all Brobnar, right? The best that Brobnar has to offer, in theory, in your cube. So but nonetheless, there are certain people who have heavy biases against houses, right? If you know people don't like playing Brobnar, and there are a couple good Brobnar cards in a pack that you pick, but there's another card that would also help you, you might take the other card, understanding that there's a higher likelihood that these Brobnar cards, even though you think they're good, still might get passed back to you because the other people just don't want to have anything to do with Brobnar. That's one example. Do they always want to play certain archetypes? Like, I'm a combo player. Most people who have played a lot of games of KeyForge with me, my friends, know that I like playing combos. So, they don't really want to pass me, certainly not Generosity, but they also don't want to pass me Battle Fleets or Key Abductions or Nature's Call or Chota or whatever, right? They don't want to pass me those cards because they know I will exploit them and abuse them and be very happy. So that's another consideration. The second consideration that I have listed here is remember Maverick options. And we talked a little bit about this earlier, but we talked a little bit about this earlier in the context of remember that high-powered cards can be Mavericked, so you don't necessarily... remember that original decision where I said you probably want to take Generosity even though it's mixing signals and sending different signals? Remember that you can Maverick stuff for that reason, but also constantly try to keep in the back of your brain what cool and crazy combinations can I make in my deck by mavericking cards into different houses, right? Can I maverick a United Action into Logos and play Library Access and then United Action and basically just play the whole deck of actions 6 times if I have enough things on the board, right? Like just nonsensical things like that. I think I mavericked a Witch of the Eye into Bravnar in one draft that I played, and then I also find a copy of Might Makes Right. So I would, I just built up all these huge creatures in my deck, and I had this combo turn where I played Might Makes Right, killed a third of the board, reaped with Witch of the Eye, brought Might Makes Right back to my head, played to my hand, played it again, killed the second third of the board, and then played like Relentless Assault or something to untap Witch of the Eye, to ready Witch of the Eye, sorry, magic term, to ready Witch of the Eye, and it would require Witch of the Eye to attack, but they had no creatures, and so then I reaped again, brought MMR back to my hand, and played Might Makes Right for the third key, so I OTK'd in one turn killed in Brobnar using Witch of the Eye, right? That's a corner example of some nonsensical stuff that you can do. Just as an example. Whatever you do though, don't be a jerk, right? Keep in mind that whoever has the cube, it's a living thing, so unless you have this sort of humor with your friends, don't maverick a battle fleet into Brobnar, right? Don't maverick rock hurling giant into Mars, because it requires you to discard Brobnar cards, right? Don't do those things unless for some reason you really want to be a jerk, because it kind of screws up the cube a little. And one other thing, I talked a little bit about this in my What is a Cube video, but if you have a cube where you have paired cards, right? So you have a routine job in the cube, but you have 2 or 3 other routine jobs on the side, and if someone drafts a routine job, then they can also play some number of those other routine jobs if they want. In those versions of cube, you need to institute a rule that the cards that have paired cards cannot be mavericked, right? So you need to tell everyone about the paired cards before the draft, show them, here are all the paired cards, here's what they are, but you can't maverick the paired cards because then it gets super messy. Because then all the cards in the side that you're getting if you draft the relevant card in the actual cube get, like, they're all the other house, and you either have to maverick all those cards or, like, it just gets messy. So you should have a rule that you can't maverick any paired cards. But absolutely, other than those things, have fun. Create crazy maverick combos. That's part of the fun of mavericking in cube. That's part of the legacy board game aspect of it. Right? Do cool things, experiment with cool things, pull nonsensical stuff like out on your opponents and see what happens. The final thing I have listed here is remember the number of players. And again, we talked about this extensively earlier, but remember when you're looking at a pack, how many people are left in the draft and how many cards you're going to get out of that pack, right? Because you can calculate at any time, anywhere in the draft, just based on math, how many cards you're going to get out of this pack. So if you look at a pack and they're like, wow, there are 3 cards I really want out of this pack, but you are only going to get 2 of them, and you don't know what the second card is going to be because you don't know what's going to be available when it's passed around to you, you have to keep that in the back of your mind at all times. Remember the number of players. Remember how many cards you're going to see in each pack. The shorthand for that is you just look at the cards in front of you, divide those cards by the number of people, and any fraction of a number, you round that up, right? So you never round down. So if you have, if you have 6 people in the draft and there are 15 cards in front of you in a pack, you're going to get 3 cards out of that pack, including the card you're about to pick, right? Because 15 divided by 6 is 2 and change. The change is always going to be worth a card, so you'll get 3 cards. That's a shorthand way for you how you can always know how many cards you're getting out of a pack. So those are some considerations you always want to take into account. So that is how I approach cube draft strategy. There are obviously many different areas of strategy that are replete for further research, experimentation, but I just find this so fun, right? I love cube draft. I want other people to have fun with it, experiment with it, do different things, and just generally enjoy the universe of KeyForge in a different way that you might not have done before, but it's still pretty fun. You can build some degenerate decks in cube. You can build some mid-range decks in cube. You can even make a cube if you for the totally wild people out there who wanted to make a cube that is just the cube is built out of terrible cards, right? So it's like a reversal cube, right? And you have the worst cards in each house in a cube, and you try to make decks and win. Now, I don't like reversal. That's not my thing, so that's not something I would do, but I know there are a lot of people out there who like the challenge of reversal and like making the best out of a bad situation. So if you wanted to do it that way, you could build a cube, you know, or have someone else build a cube for you that had just terrible cards in there. And just as a final point, I have my Discord up here. Feel free to message me with any questions you have. I also will throw a brief plug in here. I do make these cubes and sell them fully assembled with the sticker packs and everything that you saw that I made in the first video. I sell them to people. So if you're interested in that, contact me. I'm happy to work with you and build a cube for you. But ultimately, even if you know, whether you make your own cube, whether you buy a cube from someone else, whether you play someone else's cube, whether you buy a cube from me, it doesn't matter to me at the end of the day. The reason I'm making these videos is because I want to spread the gospel of cube, if you will. I want people to learn more about this fun way to play KeyForge and experiment with them if that's something they want to do. You know, and definitely when this, I'm recording this in December of 2020, so when this virus finally settles down, when we get some vaccines out in the universe and we start having organized play, I will be doing everything in my power, as I did last year, to attend as many Vault Tours as I can. I'll be bringing my cube. You know, I always want to have fun side events after the main events, day 1, day 2, for those people who are interested to play cube. So you'll catch me around playing that all the time. It's one of my favorite things to do. I hope you enjoyed this video. Like I said, there's my contact information. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Discord is the best way to reach me. And yeah, that's all I got. Enjoy cubing.